The tension in the Senate Judiciary Committee room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the witness table, her navy blue blazer crisp, her expression calm but determined. Across from her, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh leaned back in his chair with that familiar smirk, the same one that infuriated millions during his confirmation hearings. What happened next would send shockwaves through Washington and make Crockett a household name overnight. Congresswoman Kavanaugh began, his voice dripping with condescension. Perhaps someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude. The room fell silent, every phone started recording, and Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a response that would leave Kavanaugh speechless, and have the entire internet talking. Before we dive into this incredible showdown, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss these epic political moments. Now let's see how Crockett absolutely destroyed Kavanaugh's arrogance. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two people are, and why this moment mattered so much. Jasmine Crockett isn't your typical politician. At just 42 years old, she's already made waves as one of the most fearless voices in Congress. A former civil rights attorney from Dallas, Texas, Crockett built her reputation taking on powerful interests and winning. She didn't come from money or political dynasties. She worked her way through law school, spent years fighting for everyday people in courtrooms across Texas, and earned every single thing she achieved. Her journey to Congress wasn't easy or inevitable. Born in St. Louis and raised in a working-class family, Crockett moved to Texas for college and never left. She put herself through the University of Houston Law Center while working multiple jobs, including waiting tables and tutoring other students. After graduation, she could have joined a big corporate law firm and made serious money. Instead, she chose to open her own practice, focusing on civil rights cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch. For over a decade, Crockett represented clients who have been discriminated against in housing, employment, and voting rights. She won case after case against powerful defendants who thought they could outlast or outspend her. Her reputation grew throughout Texas legal circles as someone who would take on anyone, no matter how powerful, if the law was on her side. Her political career began almost by accident after winning a major voting rights case that protected polling locations in predominantly black neighborhoods. Local Democratic leaders started asking her to run for office. She initially said no, preferring courtroom advocacy to political campaigning, but when she saw how many problems required legislative solutions rather than just legal ones, she finally agreed to run for the Texas legislature in 2020. Even in the Texas legislature, Crockett stood out. While other freshman legislators stayed quiet and followed party leadership, she immediately began challenging powerful interests and asking uncomfortable questions. Her legal background made her particularly effective at spotting loopholes in proposed legislation and constitutional problems that others missed. When Crockett speaks, she doesn't use fancy political language or dance around issues. She tells the truth directly and powerfully. That's exactly what made her such a threat to someone like Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh, on the other hand, represents everything wrong with the current system. Appointed to the Supreme Court despite serious allegations and a confirmation hearing that showed his true character, Kavanaugh had spent years making decisions that hurt working families while protecting the wealthy and powerful. His privileged background, elite prep schools, Yale University, handed opportunities at every turn, created a man who looked down on anyone who dare questions authority. But here's what made this confrontation so important. This wasn't just about these two individuals. This was about whether someone from Kavanaugh's world of privilege could silence a black woman who had fought her way to Congress. This was about whether the Supreme Court could continue operating without real accountability. And this was about whether Crockett would let Kavanaugh's condescending attitude go unchallenged. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Crockett was testifying about Supreme Court ethics reforms, proposals that would directly impact Kavanaugh and his colleagues. If she backed down now, it would signal that the court was untouchable. But if she fought back successfully, it could change everything. The committee hearing had started normally enough. Crockett was there to discuss her proposed legislation requiring Supreme Court justices to follow the same ethics rules as other federal judges. It seemed routine until Kavanaugh decided to make it personal. Congresswoman Crockett, Kavanaugh had begun consulting his note to exaggerated importance. I've reviewed your proposed legislation, and frankly, I'm concerned about whether you fully understand a constitutional separation of powers. Already you could see where this was heading. The packed committee room filled with reporters, activists, and political observers sensed attention building. Crockett supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Kavanaugh's allies smiled knowingly. Crockett responded professionally. Justice Kavanaugh, I appreciate your concerns, but I believe the American people deserve transparency from all branches of government, including the Supreme Court. That's when Kavanaugh's mask started slipping. His voice took on that familiar tone, the same one he'd used during his confirmation hearings when he'd been challenged by senators. Well, Congresswoman, he said, practically sneering, constitutional law is quite complex. Perhaps you should consult with more experienced colleagues before proposing such sweeping changes to how the court operates. The room temperature seemed to drop. Several people in the audience gasped audibly. Even some Republicans on the committee looked uncomfortable with Kavanaugh's obvious disrespect, but Crockett didn't flinch. If anything, her posture straightened. She'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. What happened next was what everyone would remember. Kavanaugh, apparently thinking he was winning some kind of debate, decided to go for the kill shot. You No, Congresswoman, I've been studying constitutional law since before you passed the bar exam. Maybe someone with more experience should be handling constitutional matters of this magnitude. This is in a local courthouse in Texas. The insult was clear to everyone in the room. He wasn't just questioning her expertise, he was dismissing her entire background, her intelligence, and her right to be there. The racial and gender undertones were impossible to miss. You could hear a pin drop. Cameras zoomed in on both faces. Crockett's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed with something that made Kavanaugh supporters suddenly look nervous. But before Crockett could respond, Kavanaugh made an even bigger mistake. Perhaps emboldened by what he thought was his dominance, he decided to double down. Furthermore, he continued, his voice getting louder, I question whether Congress has any business telling the Supreme Court how to conduct itself. We are a co-equal branch of government, not some lower court that answers to politicians. The pause before politicians was deliberate and insulting. He was trying to diminish not just Crockett but her entire institution. What Kavanaugh didn't realize was that he had just stepped into a constitutional law trap by claiming that Congress had no oversight authority over the Supreme Court. He was making an argument that even conservative legal scholars would reject. The Constitution clearly gives Congress the power to regulate the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, through its authority over judicial budgets, court structure, and impeachment. Several constitutional law professors watching the hearing later noted that Kavanaugh's statement revealed either a troubling misunderstanding of separation of powers or a deliberate attempt to mislead the public about the court's accountability. Professor Jennifer Mason of Georgetown Law would later write, Justice Kavanaugh's claim that Congress has no business regulating Supreme Court ethics would have been laughed out of any first-year constitutional law classroom, but in the moment Kavanaugh seemed to believe his own rhetoric. He sat back in his chair with visible satisfaction, apparently thinking he had delivered a devastating blow to Crockett's entire premise. That's when something shifted in the room. Even some of Kavanaugh's usual allies started looking uncomfortable. The committee chair, a Republican, actually cleared his throat disapprovingly because Kavanaugh had just made a critical error. He'd given Crockett exactly the opening she needed. Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hands folded calmly on the table. The entire room held its breath. Cell phones around the gallery were recording from every angle. This was clearly about to become a moment. Justice Kavanaugh, she began, her voice steady but carry an edge that made everyone pay attention. I appreciate your perspective on constitutional law. The way she said perspective made it clear that something big was coming. Kavanaugh, still apparently thinking he was in control, actually smiled slightly. He had no idea what was about to hit him. Behind Crockett, her legal team exchanged glances. They knew what she was capable of when someone tried to dismiss her credentials. They'd seen her destroy opposing counsel in courtrooms across Texas when they'd made the mistake of underestimating her. One of her aides, Marcus Williams, who had worked with Crockett for 3 years, later described this moment. I knew Brett Kavanaugh was about to get the full Jasmine Crockett treatment. She gets this look in her eyes when someone tries to talk down to her. It's like watching a chess master who's already seen a checkmate coming in 5 moves. The committee room had transformed into something resembling a gladiatorial arena. Every seat was filled. Standing room only stretched along the walls. The press gallery was packed with reporters from every major outlet, their laptops open, fingers ready to live tweet what was clearly about to become a historic moment. Even the usually stoic security guards positioned around the room seemed more alert, sensing the electric tension that was building. One veteran Capitol Hill reporter would later say she'd covered hundreds of committee hearings over 2 decades, but had never felt energy like this before. A single response. The stage was set, the audience was primed, and Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver a master class in how to shut down institutional arrogance. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and become required viewing in law schools across the country. Crockett's voice remained perfectly calm, but every word landed Like a precision strike, Justice Kavanaugh, since you've decided to question my qualifications, let me help clarify a few things for you and everyone watching. She pulled out a folder that her team had prepared just in case someone tried exactly this kind of attack. You mentioned that you've been studying constitutional law since before I passed the bar. That's interesting because I passed the bar in 2006, which means you think you've been studying constitutional law since, well, let's see, you graduated from Yale Law in 1990, so that would be about 16 years. You're claiming the room was dead silent. Even Kavanaugh's smile started to fade. But here's what's really interesting, Justice Kavanaugh. While you were working as a political operative, yes, that's what you were, not a constitutional scholar investigating President Clinton and working on Republican campaigns, I was actually in courtrooms defending people's constitutional rights. Crockett opened her folder and began reading from prepared notes. Her legal team had done their homework. Since you brought up experience, let's talk about experience. During my time as a civil rights attorney, I won constitutional cases protecting voting rights, defending free speech, and ensuring equal protection under the law. Real constitutional work in real courtrooms with real consequences for real people. She looked up directly at Kavanaugh, who was now visibly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, your pre-court career was spent doing political opposition research and working for Kenneth Starr, not exactly constitutional scholarship. Justice Kavanaugh, the audience was starting to murmur with approval. This wasn't just a response, it was a systematic dismantling. But Crockett wasn't done, not even close. But since we're talking about qualifications and experience, Justice Kavanaugh, let's discuss why we're really here today. You mentioned that the Supreme Court shouldn't answer to politicians, but you know what? The Supreme Court should answer to the American people. Her voice began to rise, slightly gaining power, and the American people deserve and know why you've accepted luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and private jet flights without disclosing them, violations that would get any other federal judge sanctioned or removed. The room erupted, gavels banged as people tried to restore order. Kavanaugh's face had gone red. This was not going the way he'd planned. Crockett waited for quiet, then delivered what would become the most quoted part of her response. You want to lecture me about constitutional law, Justice Kavanaugh? Let me give you a constitutional lesson. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution. You know that document you claim to revere states that civil officers of the United States can be removed from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. She paused, letting that sink in. Taking undisclosed gifts while making decisions that benefit your wealthy friends. That's exactly what the founders had in mind when they wrote those words. Then came the moment that would go viral within minutes. But let's get back to your original point about experience, Justice Kavanaugh. You suggested that maybe someone with more experience should handle constitutional matters. You're absolutely right. Kavanaugh looked confused. Was she agreeing with him? Someone with more experience should be on the Supreme Court, someone who actually respects the Constitution instead of treating it like a suggestion, someone who understands that equal justice under law applies to everyone, including Supreme Court justices, someone who doesn't throw tantrums when asked basic questions about ethics. The reference to his confirmation hearing behavior was unmistakable. The audience was fully engaged now, some people standing to applaud. So here's my question for you, Justice Kavanaugh. If you can't handle basic ethics questions from a congresswoman you think is beneath you, how can the American people trust you to handle the most important constitutional questions of our time? Crockett leaned back in her chair, her voice becoming almost conversational, which somehow made it even more devastating. And one more thing, Justice Kavanaugh, you mentioned this is in a local courthouse in Texas. You're absolutely right. Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules. Maybe you should try it sometime. The room exploded. People were on their feet applauding. Social media was already lighting up, and Brett Kavanaugh sat there, his mouth slightly open, looking like someone had just slapped him with a constitutional textbook. When the noise died down, Kavanaugh tried to respond. His voice was shaky, his usual confidence completely gone. Congresswoman, the Supreme Court has always maintained its independence, but his words were weak, defensive. The damage was done. He'd walked into that room thinking he could intimidate a freshman congresswoman, and instead he'd been systematically dismantled on live television. We follow appropriate guidelines, he continued. But even he seemed to realize how pathetic it sounded. Crockett simply smiled. I'm sure you do, Justice Kavanaugh, I'm sure you do. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Crockett calm, prepared, devastating. Kavanaugh flustered, defensive, defeated. What happened next was unprecedented. The gallery, which included law students, civil rights activists, and everyday Americans who had come to watch the hearing, erupted in sustained applause. People were cheering, clapping, and some were even chanting, "Jasmine, Jasmine." The committee chair tried to restore order, but the energy in a room was electric. This wasn't just a political moment, it was a cultural moment. A black woman from Texas had just educated a Supreme Court justice about constitutional law and ethics, and everyone knew they'd witnessed something special. Among those in the gallery was Maria Rodriguez, a third-year law student from Howard University who had driven down from D.C. specifically to watch the ethics hearing. "I've never seen anything like it," She would later tell reporters here was a Supreme Court justice trying to intimidate a black woman, and she just dismantled him piece by piece. I literally got chills when she delivered that line about Texas judges following ethics rules. Also present was retired federal judge Patricia Williams, who had served on the bench for 30 years before stepping down. She was seen nodding approvingly throughout Crockett's response and was overheard telling a colleague, "That's exactly how you handle a bully in vote." I wish more lawyers had her backbone. When I was hearing cases, the sustained applause lasted nearly 2 minutes, an eternity. In congressional hearing term, security guards, initially concerned about the disruption, found themselves smiling as they watched the organic outpouring of support for Crockett's performance. Even some Republicans on the committee were nodding approvingly, because regardless of party, what they had just seen was a masterclass in preparation, intelligence, and courage. The immediate aftermath of Crockett's dismantling of Kavanaugh was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within 15 minutes of the exchange, #Jasmine Crockett was trending #1 on Twitter. The clip of her saying, "Local courthouse judges in Texas actually follow ethics rules. Maybe you should try it sometime," had already been viewed over 100,000 times. The meme started immediately. One showed Kavanaugh with the caption, "When you tried a man's plain constitutional law to a constitutional lawyer." Another featured Crockett with the text, "That's how you shut down a Supreme Court bully." But it wasn't just jokes. Legal experts were weighing in with serious analysis. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe tweeted, "Congresswoman Crockett just delivered the most effective takedown of judicial arrogance I've ever witnessed. This is what accountability looks like." News networks scrambled to get the story on air. CNN's legal analyst called it a watershed moment for Supreme Court accountability. MSNBC ran the clip on loop with the headline, "Freshman Congresswoman Schools Supreme Court Justice." Even Fox News, typically supportive of conservative justices, had trouble defending Kavanaugh's performance. One commentator noted that Justice Kavanaugh walked into that room overconfident and left looking like he'd been schooled by someone half his age. The Washington Post editorial board would later write, "Congresswoman Crockett's response to Justice Kavanaugh demonstrated something we rarely see in Washington, any more preparation, principle, and a courage to speak truth to power." Within hours, Democratic leaders were rallying behind Crockett. Speaker of the House released a statement. Congresswoman Crockett exemplified the best of what Congress can be today. Her thoughtful, prepared, and powerful response reminds us why we need more voices like hers in Washington. Progressive organizations immediately started fundraising off the moment. Jasmine Crockett just showed us how to fight back became a rallying cry for groups pushing for Supreme Court reform, but perhaps more importantly, several moderate Republicans quietly reached out to Crockett's office to discuss her ethics legislation. The moment had shifted the entire debate around Supreme Court accountability. In the days following the confrontation, things began to change in ways no one had expected. She went from being a relatively unknown freshman congresswoman to a national figure overnight. Speaking requests poured in from law school, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. Her Twitter following jumped by 200,000 in a single week, but more importantly, her ethics legislation suddenly had momentum. Senators who had previously ignored the bill were now asking for meetings. The public pressure created by her viral moment had given Supreme Court reform real political power for the first time in decades. The impact was far more damaging. Ethics complaint against him increased dramatically. Legal scholars began publishing detailed analyses of his behavior during the hearing, with many concluding that his conduct was inappropriate for a Supreme Court justice. More significantly, his influence on the court appeared to diminish. Other justices, according to insider reports, were concerned about being associated with his public embarrassment. His questions during oral arguments became noticeably more restrained as he was worried about creating another viral moment of judicial arrogance. The institution itself faced new scrutiny. Public opinion polls showed increasing support for term limits, ethics requirements, and other reforms. The court's approval rating, already low, dropped further as people began to see it as an unaccountable institution protected by arrogant justices. But beyond immediate political consequences, Crockett's moment represented something larger. In an era when institutions seemed untouchable and powerful people face no consequences, she had shown that preparation, intelligence, and courage could still win the day. Young lawyers, particularly women and people of color, began sharing stories about how Crockett's example had inspired them to speak up in their own workplaces. Law schools started using exchange as a teaching tool for effective advocacy. The moment also highlighted the changing demographics of American politics. Crockett represented a new generation of leaders, diverse, educated, and unintimidated by traditional power structures. Her success signaled that the old boys club was finally facing real challenges. Crockett didn't let the moment fade away. She used her newfound platform strategically. She introduced expanded ethics legislation that went further than her original proposal. She organized hearings featuring ethics experts who detailed exactly how Supreme Court justices had violated standard judicial conduct rules. She created a public database tracking undisclosed gifts and potential conflict of interest. Most importantly, she kept the pressure on Kavanaugh. Specifically, every time he spoke publicly, Crockett's team was ready with fact checks and context that reminded people of his ethical problems. Within weeks of the viral confrontation, Crockett had leveraged her momentum into concrete action. She appeared on every major Sunday talk show, each time armed with specific examples of judicial misconduct that she delivered with the same precision that had demolished Kavanaugh. Her media appearances became must-watch television because viewers knew she would deliver substantive content rather than typical political talking points. The momentum also attracted high-profile allies. Former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens' family released a statement supporting Crockett's reform efforts, noting that Stevens himself had advocated for stronger ethics rules before his death. Constitutional law professors from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford organized a public letter endorsing her legislation, specifically citing her exceptional command of constitutional principles and judicial ethics. But perhaps most tellingly, Crockett received private support from current federal judges who couldn't speak publicly but were frustrated with the Supreme Court's lack of accountability. Anonymous messages poured into her office from judges across the country thanking her for saying what they couldn't. Her office also revealed that in the month following the Kavanaugh exchange, they had received over 50,000 individual donations, averaging $47 each, a grassroots fundraising surge that demonstrated genuine public engagement with Supreme Court reform rather than just viral entertainment. Conservative media tried to frame Crockett as disrespectful and out of line, but their arguments fell flat. Even many Republicans couldn't defend Kavanaugh's condescending behavior or his ethical lapses. Some conservative commentators actually praised Crockett's preparation and effectiveness, even while disagreeing with her politics. As one Fox News contributor noted, "I don't agree with her agenda, but I respect her ability to make her case. She did her homework, and it showed." The response from Republican lawmakers themselves was notably muted. Several GOP members of the Judiciary Committee declined to defend Kavanaugh's performance. When asked by reporter Senator John Cornyn of Texas, normally a reliable conservative voice, said only that all public officials should maintain appropriate decorum, a statement that many interpreted as criticism of Kavanaugh rather than Crockett. Behind closed doors, Republican strategists were reportedly furious with Kavanaugh for creating such a politically damaging moment. One anonymous GOP operative told Politico, "We spend all this time talking about liberal judicial activism, and then one of our own justices goes on TV and acts like he's above basic ethics rules. It's a gift to the Democrats we didn't need to give." The split response revealed deeper tensions within conservative movement about the Supreme Court's public image. Younger conservative lawyers, particularly those who had to defend the court's legitimacy in academic and professional settings, were especially critical of Kavanaugh's performance. The Federalist Society, while not officially commenting, reportedly had internal discussions about whether Kavanaugh's behavior was harmful to their broader judicial project. Even traditionally supported conservative legal blogs struggled to defend the exchange. Several posts attempted to criticize Crockett's grandstanding but ended up spending more words explaining why Kavanaugh's initial comments were problematic. The difficulty of mounting an effective defense became a story in itself, with legal commentators noting that when your allies can't defend you, you probably lost. Argument 6 months later, the impact of that single exchange was still being felt throughout Washington. Crockett's ethics legislation had passed the House and was gaining support in the Senate. Kavanaugh had largely disappeared from public view, making no more public appearances after several additional ethics stories emerged. But perhaps most importantly, the moment had inspired a new generation of advocates to believe that accountability was possible. As Crockett said in a later interview, that day wasn't about me versus Justice Kavanaugh, it was about whether we're going to accept a system where powerful people think they're above the rules. I'm proud we send a clear message that we won't. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Brett Kavanaugh became more than just a viral moment. It became a symbol of changing power dynamics in American politics. It showed that expertise, preparation, and courage could still triumph over institutional arrogance. As for what's next, Crockett's profile continues to rise. There's already talk of her running for Senate or even higher office someday. Meanwhile, her ethics legislation continues to gain momentum, with polling showing overwhelming public support for Supreme Court reform. Political insiders began seriously discussing Crockett as a potential future Attorney General, or even Supreme Court Justice herself. Her combination of prosecutorial experience, constitutional expertise, and proven ability to stand up to powerful interests made her an obvious candidate for higher judicial roles. When asked about these possibilities in interviews, Crockett remained focused on her current work but didn't rule anything out. The impact extended beyond individual careers to institutional change. Law schools across the country began incorporating the Crockett-Kavanaugh exchange into their curricula, using it as a case study in effective advocacy and judicial accountability. The American Bar Association cited her performance as an example of how lawyers should prepare for high-stakes questioning. International legal observers also took notice. Legal reform advocates in other countries began studying Crockett's approach as a model for challenging unaccountable judicial systems. The exchange was translated into multiple languages and shared in legal reform movements worldwide. Perhaps most significantly, public opinion research showed that Crockett's moment had fundamentally shifted how Americans view Supreme Court accountability. A post-confrontation poll found that 73% of Americans now supported term limits for Supreme Court justices, up from 58% before the hearing. Support for mandatory ethics rules jumped from 67% to 81%. The message is clear: the old guard can't simply dismiss new voices anymore. When someone like Jasmine Crockett walks into a room, they better come prepared for a real fight. And Brett Kavanaugh, well, let's just say he probably wishes he'd been a little more respectful to that inexperienced congresswoman from Texas. Sources close to the Supreme Court reported that Kavanaugh had become noticeably more cautious in his public appearances, apparently aware that any sign of arrogance could trigger another viral moment of accountability. What do you think? Did Jasmine Crockett handle Kavanaugh perfectly, or should she have gone even harder? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more moments when politicians get exactly what they deserve. The next showdown is always just around the corner, and you won't want to miss.